Sturtevant, and this is Kayla Newharth, and we are students in the graduate program of Hydrologic Sciences. And we have the pleasure of introducing to you the next speaker for our Water Visions colloquium series, Dr. Naomi Tague.
Dr. Tague is a professor in the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at the University of California at Santa Barbara. After receiving her Bachelor's of Engineer, Dr. Tague continued on the University of Toronto, where she received her Master's and PhD in Geography. Dr. Tague's research interests include the interactions between hydrology and ecosystems processes and exploring how eco-hydrologic systems are altered by climate and land use change. Much of her work involves developing and using spatial simulations models to integrate data from field-based monitoring studies. She was a principal developer of the notable ecohydraulic model RHESIS, which is used to simulate the spatial distribution of water, carbon, and nutrient cycling over variable terrain.
Today, Dr. Tague will be delivering a talk titled Forest Density Reduction, Impacts on Productivity, Water Use, and Drought Resilience. As a leader in the field of ecohydrology, Dr. Tague will share findings on forest management strategies and the use of eco-hydrologic models to address questions about how changing the forest structure can improve forest health, reduce forest fires, and increase stream flow in Mediterranean climates like we know here. We are very excited to have her here today at UNR, so please join us in welcoming her to the stage.
So thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to be here and see lots of people, lots of familiar faces, and then meeting some new people as well. So it's really great. Today I'm going to talk about three things that I personally think are important, and I think you will too. One of these is fire. We all live in the Western U.S. We get headlines like this every summer, right? Fire also costs us literally billions of dollars every year. So as a society, it's something we really care about. Scientifically, fire is really interesting. Where is it happening? Why is it happening? How is it changing? So fire. We also care about water, right? Recent droughts in California led to lawn watering restrictions, led to reduction in agricultural productivity. Droughts are a serious problem in the Western US. That's two. The third thing is forest health. During the most recent drought in California, the Forest Service estimates that we lost millions of trees, right? You can walk around parts of the Sierras and you can look up on hill slopes and it's just covered with red. What are the implications of this for forest health? It's huge. So the other interesting thing about fire and water and forest health is that we know it's changing. Temperatures have already been increasing. And with increasing temperatures, we know that we get a longer fire season, right? We know that it has impacts on snowmelt that affect summer stream flow and increase water scarcity. We also know that with warmer temperatures, the same drought is more likely to lead to forest mortality. And we've been seeing evidence of that throughout the globe, right? So there's two key science questions that are related to fire and hydrologic drought and the impacts of drought on vegetation productivity. And I would say we really want to know, how do these things interact and how is this going to change in the next coming decades? Now, I'm going to focus a fair bit on the Western US, but I'm asking this question broadly in Mediterranean-type ecosystems. I also do work in Spain, I do work in Israel, and places like Australia, places like South Africa, they deal with very similar issues, right? They all have this problem of fire and water and impacts on forest mortality. And because this is a problem, it's having huge societal and environmental impacts, there's always the question, what can we do, right? So how do human interventions, particularly forest management and forest density reduction, how do they affect this interaction between fire and forest health and hydrology? But I also want to make sure I can answer this question, not broadly, not for all of California, but at a watershed scale. And why do I want to focus on a watershed scale? because that's the scale that we manage watersheds. When you're a forest manager and you're going out and you're doing a field treatment, you're not field treating the entire western US, right? You're field treating a particular forest. So I want to be able to be precise enough that I can answer this question at that hill slope to watershed scale. So to do this, I think it's important to think about this as a fully coupled system. You can't just look at all these pieces in isolation, largely because they impact each other, right? You know, what kind of forest structure, sorry, let me figure out how to, what kind of forest structure we have impacts the amount of stream flow we have and soil moisture. Soil moisture affects fire, right? Fire then affects ecosystem structure. The other big piece in here is humans, right? We go in and we change the landscape in a variety of different ways. It's a type of disturbance, if you will, but then it feeds back onto things that we care about. So you can't look at these without looking at their relationships. So because I was interested in that, I spent some time with a bunch of colleagues, some fire ecologists that I know, some ecohydrologists, but probably more novel for me was I spent a bunch of time with some economists and political scientists in my department. And we wrote an NSF grant, which is kind of what you do, and we got this hazard seas, $2 million, to really look at this as a fully coupled system, right? And what we proposed to do was to develop a model that included these biophysical things that we're interested in, right? Soil moisture, stream flow, forest carbon sequestration, vegetation growth, how it varies with climate, terrain, and land cover. But link that with a fire model, right? And with models about how humans make decisions on the landscape, but have those be fully coupled, right? And we spent a bunch of years doing that. So when you take on something like this, it's really good to not start from scratch, right? Because this is hard. This is really hard to do. So we didn't start from scratch. We worked with RESIS. The reason we worked with RESIS is I'm the principal lead developer of RESIS. And so we have an existing cyber infrastructure, right? We have a lot of development that's already gone on. So we had a framework that we could hook in these other pieces, the fire spread model, some of the social science that we were doing. And we had designed this model in a way that it made it easy, or relatively easy, Erin, are you laughing? To add these different pieces, right? And the other advantage of using RESIS is that it's been around for a while. So we've tested it in a variety of different locations, both in the Western US, but also in Mediterranean type ecosystems in Europe. And so we've learned a lot about how well the model represents different mechanisms and processes. So we're not reinventing the wheel, right? We already have a lot of embedded knowledge in this model that we're taking advantage of. And I think that's important. So I'm going to eventually start talking about how we linked it with the fire spread model, and then how we went ahead and added in some of the human components of that. But I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what we were able to do with the existing biophysical model related to the impact of forest density reduction, and some of the changes that we've had to make, and some of the things we're learning just from the biophysical component of the model, right? Particularly asking how do changes in stand structure, whether it's through fuel treatments or mortality, how does that impact water, forest mortality, some of the things we care about at these watershed to hill slope scales, right? Now, just a quick refresher for those of you who might be asking, well, why are we going in and doing these field treatments anyway? Why is this density reduction such a big deal? And that's an entire lecture, and people spend a lot of time thinking about this, but if you remember, the basic story is simply that, you know, because of fire suppression, I'm really not good with this point up there, it's at the top. Because of fire suppression, we had forests that used to look like this, that now look like this, right? And because of that, we have evidence of an increase in fire severity, right? Given all kinds of way of looking at previous fire severity, right? So that gives us motivation, at least from a fire perspective, of doing field treatments. But there's been a lot of talk, in California in particular, but in different places, about, well, there's other reasons to reduce this density, right? One of them might be that maybe we'll get more water in the streams, right? The other one would be that maybe the remaining trees will be less drought stressed, right? Because you removed some of the forest, right? But whether or not that works and how well it works is likely to depend on the climate when you do the thinning, things about the geology, species composition, and how you do the density reduction, how much you remove, what do you remove. So all of this is hard to figure out just using empirical data because there's so much variation in all of these factors. However, let's look at a couple of examples just to give you a sense of why this is complicated. So a really simple way of thinking about this would be to say, if I take out a certain amount of biomass, the transpiration should just reduce proportionally to that, right? That would be kind of your null hypothesis. And it's always good to start there, right? So that means if I remove 20% of the above ground biomass, my ET should go down by 20%. I can assure you that's not what happens, right? There's almost no situation where that occurs. And in fact, in this study, just to give you one example, shows estimates of change in water yield based on stream flow data related to mortality events that occurred in the western US. And this is just one example, but you can see that depending on how much of the biomass was removed, you get both increases and decreases. You actually get situations where the ET actually went up, right? So it's clearly not as simple as you take away 25% of the biomass and you get this bump of 20% in water yield. And even if you look at clear-cutting studies, right, that have been, many people have done synthesis work on this empirically over the globe, yeah, you get increases in water yield as you remove forest cover, right? There is a signal there. But look at the scatter in this data. It's huge. And the slopes are different depending on the different species. What's more is these studies generally are looking just in the first year after this harvesting, which is pretty dramatic. It's a lot more than thinning. They're just looking at the first year. But we don't just care about the first year. We want to manage forests for multiple years. If I have to go out and thin the forest every year, it's just not feasible. We can't do that. So we also have to look at recovery. And the few studies that have looked at recovery of water yield show very different rates of recovery. And some of them show situations where you get, again, actually declines in water yield, right? So why does that occur, right? And that's important because if we're going to model this, we want to make sure we include some of the things that recent literature suggests are the reason that we don't have, say, a proportional reduction in transpiration with a proportional to the amount of biomass you take out. Why is that? Well, it kind of makes sense, right? A lot of other things happen when you take out biomass. For one thing, you're no longer shading understory, so maybe its transpiration goes up, right? Maybe you're no longer shading the gaps, you're making more gaps, so maybe those gaps are evaporating more. Maybe you're changing the dynamics of snowmelt, right? You're also changing interception, right? And that might have complicated impacts on soil evaporation and the evaporation of the remaining trees. And how about the remaining trees? Maybe they're just taking up that water, right? On top of that, if you put it into a hill slope scale context, maybe you are getting additional water coming out of this plot, but it's just going down and it's feeding trees that are downslope, that are hungry for water, right? So there's all of these compensating factors that we want to be thinking about. And then if we're going to recover from our thinning, if we want to look at the response over time, we also have to be thinking about, well, how quickly does it recover? But also, what if we change species? Maybe some of those long-term situations, in fact, some of those long-term situations where empirical data showed a decline or an increase in ET was because what grew back was more water consumptive, right? And then ultimately, if we go back to my whole, hey, this is a coupled system, what if you're changing the fire regime? That's also going to have a hydrologic effect. So to really answer this question, you have to look at these recovery dynamics as well, right? So we need a model that can start to capture these compensating effects and these effects that are related to the evolution of the forest after you do the thinning. So RESIS has a lot of that already, right? We had overstory and understory evaporation. We separately model transpiration and evaporation, right? We model soil evaporation. We model snow melt in a with enough of the radiation physics to maybe get it right, although Anne would probably tell me I don't. But we approximate. At least it's there. And maybe when we work with Ann more, we can do an even better job. And we have lateral redistribution, so we can account for the fact that if you use less water up here, it becomes available here. And we coupled it years ago to a carbon cycling model, so we could account for the recovery over time. And it's fully coupled to the hydrology model, so we get this, hey, if there's more water, you're going to have more photosynthesis, you're going to grow faster, right? So we can account for this regrowth because we have it fully coupled to a carbon cycling model after the thinning or fire or mortality event, right? And we've also spent time to make sure we do this reasonably well, right? We've compared the model with evapotranspiration data from flux towers. We've done a lot of work comparing the model with stream flow data. We've also done work where we've compared the model with tree rings. This was done in another Mediterranean site in the Pyrenees. But what's interesting here is this is tree ring growth and Rhesus modeled net primary productivity. And what's encouraging for us is we get this big dip in productivity that we see in the tree rings also with the model. And we do a much better job than you get with kind of typical annual water deficit indices that people often use to try to predict forest water stress. So because we're going into the details of the forest productivity, we're able to do a reasonable job of capturing that. But all of these examples, there's things missing in them. They're not a perfect evaluation of the model. And one thing that we hadn't spent as much time on until we really started asking these questions about thinning was to say, well, what's the relationship between, the gap that you're creating when you take out a tree? And one of the things that we thought was really interesting was, well, do the remaining trees get that water, right? Are the roots overlapped like this, or are they not? And in order to be able to model those types of things, we had to do some changes to Rhesus, right? Instead of modeling kind of a forest stand patch, we had to break these patches up into areas that have thin trees or gaps and areas that have the original trees. And we had to model the exchanges of water between them, as well as the exchange between patches going down a hill slope. And we're still working on that, and I'm just going to show you some preliminary results. But this is a really hard thing to do because we don't really know, again, how well root systems overlap. We don't know what that local exchange of water is. But we think it might be important, and we can use the model to at least assess how important it was. We've also done some work now to say, now that we've created this kind of gap model inside a spatially distributed routing model, if you will, right? We should do some testing of that, right? How do we do that? One of the ways is we work with collaborators that do really good field experiments, right? Where they can go out and thin forests and measure exactly what happens at that tree scale, right? So I've been working with some collaborators in Israel at the Yatir Forest, which is a Mediterranean Aleppo pine forest, right? Doesn't look, same as here. They get all their water most of their water in the summer, in the winter, with significant water stress in the summer, right? And what these guys did is, in the autumn of 2009, they took a 300 stem per hectare forest and they thinned it by a third to 100 stems per hectare forest, right? And they measured leaf scale processes both before and after, and of the trees that were in the unthinned and the non-thinned site. And they're close enough to each other that they have the same radiation environment, the same soils, the same precipitation. And they measure things like needle scale photosynthesis and transpiration, vapor pressure deficit, the amount of radiation these needles got, right? So they could see what was the effect of thinning, what changed, right? And they monitored a lot of trees and they did a lot of work. And this is what they found. So you're really looking at kind of averaging needle scale measurements over trees in the thinned and unthinned plots. So what this plot shows is, and we're just going to focus on the difference between the 300 tree per hectare plot and the 100. They also had a 200 one, but I'm just going to look at these two. So what they found was that you get, let's look at PAR, right? So how much radiation your needles are on average absorbing, it goes up when you thin. So even though you wouldn't think that forest was radiation limited and there was that much shading, it's still a significant effect, right? You're getting the thinned trees are getting more radiation, right? And their assimilation rates went up, right? So per needle assimilation, carbon assimilation, they were more productive. They were doing more photosynthesis per leaf, right? We didn't see much change at all in per leaf transpiration and much change at all in vapor pressure deficit at the leaf scale. And the needles were also, there was also more new needle growth in the thinned stand. So that suggests that there was this bump in productivity. And when we run RHESIS, we see a similar thing, which made us feel good. We see that this shows leaf scale absorb photosynthetic radiation throughout the season. The red shows the thinned, the blue shows the original 300 stems per hectare. And we get this bump in PAR that's consistent, right, with the observed. Given that they only measured on 15 days, we're not going to be able to expect this to match exactly, but we see the same direction and the same rough magnitude of response. It's the kind of comparison where at least we're getting the right kind of magnitude direction. Similarly, we also show this bump in leaf scale assimilation, right? So these leaves, partially because they're getting more radiation, are more productive. And because our hypothesis is because they're getting more water and they're putting on more leaves, they have more new leaves. And new leaves tend to have higher water use efficiency. And what's cool is both the observations and the model suggest that. So I think this is a really nice, and we see our model estimates about a 40% gain. The observed is 60%. That's similar enough for me, given the limitations in the model, in the observational data. The other thing that was consistent with observation, they didn't see any evidence of increased recharge. So they would suggest that the soil and litter evaporation completely compensated for the reduction in transpiration. And our model shows a similar thing, right? When we thin the stands, when we go from 300 stems per hectare to 100, we show a decrease in transpiration, but an increase in evaporation. There's a little bit of a change there, but it's mostly taken up by this increase in evaporation. And that is consistent with what they're finding at this field studies. So what's nice about this is it gives us some confidence based on previous applications of RHESIS and this new work we're doing at the plot scale that we can believe our measurement, or we can believe our model estimates. Then we can use the model to ask the bigger question, which are how do all these different controls, climate, precipitation, the timing of snowmelt, and vegetation structure and composition and rooting depth, when we vary all these, what does it mean about the effect of thinning on forest water use and forest water yield, right? So just to give you an example of how we can use the model, right? For a particular site, we can say, well, we don't know that much about the subsurface drainage characteristics. We don't know what the climate is going to be when you go out and thin. You don't know what if you're going to thin it, the next year is going to be dry, maybe it's going to be wet. We don't know, right? There's things about the rooting characteristics we don't know, and we want to play games with what type of thinning you do. How intense is that thinning, right? So we do this experiment for a place we have some measurements to calibrate the model. Here we've been doing this at the Sierra CZO, which is a mid-elevation mixed conifer forest, kind of above Fresno, if that means anything to you. Some of you may be familiar with the Critical Zone Observatory Network, so we were using that particular field site. And because we have a model, we can now say, okay, let's thin in every possible year given the historic climate record. This shows precipitation deviation from the mean. So you have wet years, you have dry years, and we thin in every possible year. We allow the vegetation to recover. We vary the thinning intensity from 0 to give us a baseline unthinned scenario up to 50%. We say, how does the response change if the soil is really shallow versus if it's really deep? And then we also vary what we assume about really the spacing between trees and whether or not those roots overlap. And there we kind of do the end member situation. Imagine the roots completely share water, or imagine they don't share water at all. How much does that change what we predict? And so one thing we can do is we can just say, well, how much variation do you get by accounting for those different factors, right? And you could show this to a water manager and say, okay, this is the range of change in ET that you might get for across all of those different scenarios, right? And this is how it recovers after the thinning. So, I mean, what you would assume from this is, on average, if what you really cared about was water yield, right? Pretty much, on average, over all that uncertainty, it's going to be gone after about 8 years, right? But sometimes, even in the first year, you're actually going to get bumps in understory evapotranspiration, right, and actually reduce water yield. So it kind of depends on how you want to think about it, whether or not you should thin and how often you should thin, if your goal happens to be increasing water yield, right? But we can also start to tease out what controls some of that variation, right? So we can use the model to say, well, how much is due to this climate effect, whether you're thinned in a wet year versus a dry year, and how much is related to this question about what are the roots doing in the subsurface? How much is our uncertainty about root dynamics impacting our ability to predict the way in which thinning affects water yield, right? So this shows, again, the change in evapotranspiration. This is years after thinning. The box plots show the effect of climate variation. All of these are for a 30% biomass removal. And what we see is the difference between the purple and gray is whether we assume the roots are isolated. So one tree really doesn't see the water of the other tree. Their roots, they have ways of separating their root structures, and there's some species which we think do that. Or we assume they're completely shared. And you can see that makes a big difference. It's probably a bigger effect, particularly in the first couple of years after thinning, than variation in climate, which you might not have expected. We might know, of course, that's going to matter. We didn't realize how big an effect that was likely to have, right? This means we really need more information about root overlap. And this gives us a way to go back to our field scientists and say, look, if you're going to spend money, this is one of the things that would really help us come up with better estimates of how thinning affects ecohydrology, right? We can also present this data to managers in a different way, right? We can say, well, if what you want is to get more water yield, if your soils are shallow, you might actually, you're only get a bang for your buck maybe for a year, at most 2. After that, you're in danger, of actually reducing your water yield, right? If your change in ET is above this line, you're actually losing water, right? You're losing water yield. Your ET has actually gone up. If your soils are deep, then kind of on average, you could thin every 6 years. This says a lot about, at least for this site, is that if your goal is to increase water yield, maybe occasionally you're going to get a bump, but it's not going to last very long. And given the expense of fuel treatments, it makes you think twice about whether treating fuels is a good way to get more water out of your system, right? Now, to really make a point about that, we'd have to apply this everywhere, and the answer is going to be place-specific. But unless you do this and you just blindly go out and think you're going to get more water yield, I mean, this is using the best available information we have, and I think it says something meaningful. Our other question is, what happens to the remaining trees, right? So does it reduce vegetation mortality, right? So the way that we get at that is by looking at net primary productivity. What these graphs show are for shallow soils here and deep soils the first year after thinning and then 5 years after thinning. The pink shows the distribution of net primary productivity given climate variability, right? Your MPP is going to be lower in dry years in general and higher in wet years, right? And the green show how that changes as you thin more and more. The darker the green, the more you thinned. So in the immediate year after thinning, you're going to get this big bump in productivity of the remaining trees, assuming the roots share water, right? I'm making that assumption here, right? And it's going to be somewhat linearly increase as you thin more. And that's going to happen both for the shallow soils and deep soils. There's some interesting things to say about the shapes of these curves, but I'm going to skip over that for now. What's really interesting, though, is what happens 5 years later. 5 years later in the deep soils, you've basically lost that gain, right? Because those trees have taken on, they've grown to absorb that additional water, right? What's really interesting in this shallow situation, though, is in some cases you actually get lower ET, or lower NPP. And what's happening there is something you would sort of expect from forestry, right? You thin things out, the other trees grow more. If they put on more biomass and they get a drought, then they're actually going to potentially be more vulnerable to that drought. It's kind of too much of a good thing. And interestingly, during the recent drought, if you look at some of the data, it's not always the most smallest trees that are right on the margins that died. Sometimes it was trees at sort of mid-elevations that were moderately productive that were more vulnerable to the mortality. And this would be the reason, right? If you are kind of doing well most of the time and you overcommit your biomass, you then become more vulnerable. Thinning could actually create that effect in a very perverse way, although it doesn't do it for the deeper soils, right? So we're learning something by running these models, right? We're kind of coming up with estimates of how often you'd have to thin in a particular place to get an increase in water yield, what the bump in productivity is likely to be, right? And we're doing this by kind of going back and forth between the field scientist and the model, right? We're going to places like we did in Israel, and we're using that to better parameterize things. We're using what we're learning in the field to come up with better representations of processes in the model, running the model, and then saying, hey, the thing I really need you to help me figure out now is this rooting uncertainty. And then we bring that in and we go, so it's this iterative dialogue between the modeler and the experimentalist, and we've really been trying to do that. Okay, so as promised, I started out by saying, okay, but we really want to have this coupled approach. And because we're not finished this yet, I can't tell you the answers, but I can talk a little bit about the progress we've made with how we're doing the fire spread modeling and how we're doing the field treatments. So for the fire spread, we wanted to have a model that we could couple with this biophysical model that was complex enough that we could account for overstory and understory relationships and ladder fuels. If we didn't bring that in, we wouldn't be able to get these biophysical feedbacks, right? So it had to be that complex, but not as complex as something like Farsight, which some of you, if you do fire modeling, you'd be familiar with, that is used to model the actual behavior of a fire when it happens. Because the parameterization that we would need for that would not allow us to run it over many watersheds forward in time with the data that we have, right? So this was actually a simulation that would show you our little fire spread model in action, but I forgot when I made a PDF out of my talk that my little animation wouldn't work, but it's really cool. The fire spreads all over the watershed, and it doesn't really tell you anything, but it's really fun to look at. But what I can show you is how do we validate that model, right? Because if we're not modeling a particular fire, we can't compare it with an observed fire behavior. But what we can do is run it for long periods of time over a particular watershed. This happens to be the Santa Fe River watershed. And we can look at the probability that a particular part of the watershed burns and when that fire happens seasonally. And then we can compare it with long-term fire data on the fire return interval at those elevations in season, and show that we do a reasonable job of capturing historic fire return intervals in space and time. And we've now published on that, and we're somewhat happy with our fire spread model. Then the tricky thing is, well, we also said we're going to fully couple in when do people do field treatments. Well, how do you figure that out, right? So we had a hypothesis, right? And our hypothesis was that when do you do field treatments? You do field treatments when there's been a fire, right? And we call this the salience effect. And we just published a nice paper on this where we said it's really funny that actually for many things, right, fire being one of them, the salience of the fire is highest right after the fire, And you all know this, right? There's a fire, it's in the newspaper, everyone's talking about it, communities are saying, what can we do? Whereas actually the risk of another fire is probably the lowest when you've recently had a fire, right? So there's this odd kind of trade-off there. But were we just making that up in our heads? Well, so our social scientists went out and they looked at all the data from the agencies that do fuel treatments. And we looked at when those fuel treatments were happening, and the probability of doing a fuel treatment, right, for grids, if there had been a fire, right, within 2 kilometers of the WUI, within 5 kilometers WUI, and the 10 kilometers of the WUI being the wildland-urban interface, right? So if you had a fire recently nearby, turns out that the probability of having a fuel treatment goes up if there'd been a recent fire, and we can show this with data. So we can actually build an empirical model of this. And you have to condition it with other things like fuel expenditures in a given year and how much money is being allocated to the kind of the net volume of fuel treatments that are going to be done in any given year. But slowly over time, we're coming up with a model. And what's cool about this model is it's fully coupled to it's affected, not only does it affect the biophysical model, right? You do a fuel treatment, but it's also affected by how often you have fires, right? So you actually have a fully coupled system here. And I think that's kind of cool and kind of interesting. Okay, so that's what we're doing. Now, I'll say one more thing before I kind of wrap up and take questions on all of this. So one of the things that I've done this kind of modeling for many years, and one of the things I've often found very frustrating is, someone will say, yeah, but my model says this and my model says that, and then how do you know what's right? And we spent a lot of time trying to put physical realism in RHESIS, right? That we went out and we compared, leaf scale photosynthesis measurements. But there's hydrology models out there that model fuel treatments by simply reducing LAI. And we know from field evidence that that won't work. But when you're looking at a model output, how do you know what they assumed? You can find out, you can go through model code, or you can read 10 years of papers, but nobody does that. And if you think of the models that get done for doing a lot of hydrology management, and certainly fuel treatments, there's all kinds of models that are out there. And people, if you're lucky, they do some comparisons with observed data, right? Streamflow data like I did, right? But that's not just what you want, because if you're going to go forward and you're going to use the model in different situations, and if you're not going to do that, why do you have a model in the first place? Then you really want to know what the assumptions were that went into the model. And that's really hard when you're running these process-based models like RHESIS, that have a carbon cycling model, that have a nitrogen cycling model that I didn't even talk about, and all this hydrology. How do you go in there and look at that? And I actually feel that that's our biggest limitation right now in the modeling community, is that it's so hard to know what these models are doing. We don't communicate that very well. But I think we don't show what the building blocks are that are making up our models. But I think there are advances I've been working closely with some people who are computer scientists and working in human-computer interfaces, and there's a lot of new techniques out there, immersive technologies. And I mean going way beyond making prettier graphs and animations in R. I mean, as you're coding the model, maybe it should be coding visual objects that automatically create information about how the model works, right? And I've been trying to work with computer scientists to say, is there some way we could really do that, right? And I wish I could show you something really cool, but I think this is like a 5 to 10 year time horizon. But we have at least been starting the process partly by working with local artists to say, if we have a concept, like this concept about whether routes are shared or routes are independent and how that's going to affect water yield, how would you as an artist who didn't know anything about this represent it? And this is what they came up with, right? So this is actually a different way of showing the results from the modeling experiment that I showed you. We're also now working to develop, we're about halfway through developing an animation that has a series of little cubes on the landscape, right? That show you what happens with fire and climate change to this little cube and how it's different. And we're going to be driving those cubes with output from the model, right? And we're going to allow the user to play different games. So it's kind of Rhesus the game, right? I don't think we've really got to what I want in terms of exposing these black boxes, but I think it's a step in the right direction by working with computer scientists to do that. So I'll leave it there to say, this is kind of, I've talked a little bit, not as much as I'd like, about fire and this coupled human-natural system, but I think it gives you kind of a window into how we're trying to move forward on kind of this combination, right, of eco-hydrology, linking it, doing a better job of linking it with field and remote sensing data to continually improve these models. But then if what these models really are libraries of our current best available knowledge, we have to make them more visible to the users, right? So combining it with better software engineering and visualization, and all of this in doing a better job of managing our forests and our water under a changing climate. So with that, I'll thank this, of course, when you're doing these kinds of collaborative projects, it takes a lot of people. And I mostly supervise a bunch of really great postdocs and PhD students and collaborators, and I'm grateful to them every day. The best part of being a professor is the people you get to work with. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Okay, I actually have two.
Go.
My first one is, have you looked at all of the effects of streamflow? Have you looked at all of the effects of streamflow timing?
Sorry, what?
Have you looked at all at the effects of streamflow timing?
Yes, yes, very much. So we've done a lot of, it's hard to show everything in one talk, but we've done a lot of work with how, for example, changing snowmelt affects streamflow timing, and that's kind of well understood. Some of our earlier work with Rhesus was saying how geology mediates that. You get the same change in the timing of snow, gives you a very different response in terms of summer streamflow as a function of kind of the geology that you have to go through, right? I think there are some interesting questions too about how changing vegetation then affects streamflow timing. But I think it is a second order effect relative to the effect of geology, right? But it is something I'm interested in.
That does make sense. And then my second question was just a general question about Rhesus. Is Rhesus relatively easy to learn on your own?
No.
Okay.
No, and that's one of the challenges of doing it. Like, I'm trying to get at least you can visualize things, but it really does take an expert. Like, we provide training for I've trained many people, not just my own students, but students in a variety of different labs. But it usually takes a couple of months to learn it, and that's with guidance. And I have a lab manager who, develops lots of online materials, but if I had 10 programmers, I could probably make it really easy to learn, but I don't.
Okay, thank you.
So I think bringing in the artists and the illustrators in this whole thing is really cool. And so I'm interested how you make connections with the artistic community, or do you cross-train your scientists as artists?
So I've gone the role of making connections with the artistic community, right? And Ethan, who I've been working very closely with. Also, if you really find this cool, we put money in it. Okay, one of the things is we put money in our SNSF grant to do this, right? So I can pay this artist. And I mean, as a first thing, that matters, right? Good artists don't work for free, right? And you might think, oh, they think it's gonna be so cool. No, and I targeted an artist who I saw him actually do some really cool interactive visualization with both video and visual art for the physics, related to feedback in physics, nothing with environment. And I could tell I had conversations with him. So a lot of it is just like everything else. I invested hours and hours, partly because I find it interesting, talking to him until he started to understand what we do. And in a way, I guess there would be two models, right? One, you could pick an artist who works with environmental scientists a lot, who already knows a lot. But in a way, it was better to pick someone who never thought about it at all, right? Because then he asked such interesting questions. It was such a fascinating dialogue because he really knew nothing. And that gave him a way to picture it in a different way than I might have thought. Otherwise, you already have too many preconceived ideas. So I mean, who knows, but the model that's been working extremely well for us was picking an artist who didn't know anything, but who was interested and who could ask good questions and really was willing to invest in the dialogue. And I will say, like, if you're in Santa Barbara this coming spring, we're having a exhibit at the local gallery. The following year, we're doing a big exhibit at Moxie, which is the new science museum in Santa Barbara. So, I mean, we're really doing this, but it takes a lot of investment, right? It takes a lot of conversation, right?
Thank you.
Adrian, or thanks.
Thanks. That was a great talk. You started with all the big problems in forest management. I think the Sierras are a prototypical place for lots of challenges. Yet the science, arguably, is not as robust as we would want. So we're faced with these giant, imminent problems, and maybe not the science we would want. Just in a philosophical way, how do we deal with uncertainty in a risky environment?
So that's a really good question. And so I'd say a couple things. One, I tried to sort of show there that you keep those error bars, right? Like you try to run models and you keep the uncertainty. Like I didn't say, oh, I think my best guess for whether roots interact or not. I said, let's do both because we really don't know. And I was honest about that and it made my uncertainty bounds really wide. But you know, there still is a signal there over time. And you say, look, it's managers know how to deal with that. Everyone thinks, oh, managers can't deal with uncertainty. My argument against that is almost everyone in the general public can handle baseball, right? And they look at pitching averages. They know that guy is not going to go up and for sure going to get the strikeout or whatever. I'm really bad at baseball terms. Shouldn't use this analogy. But, you know, people can understand uncertainty if you present it in the right way. So part of it, I think, is being honest about the uncertainty that's there and not just calling it uncertainty. Uncertainty, why? Because there's this notion to think that uncertainty is just, oh, we don't know. No, we don't know this. We do know this, and we don't know this, right? And I think being as clear as you can about what we do know and what we don't know helps with that. I guess the other thing I would say is that we're a little bit myopic. We're often very myopic, myself included, but I've been at Bren long enough that I've gotten knocked out of it a bit. You know, the political scientists and economists have dealt with decision-making under uncertainty for decades. They've done a lot of really excellent work. You want to, like, the other people we should include in answering that question are the people who there are people who study that. There's increasingly a lot of kind of psychology and experimental work done in psychology and behavioral economics that helps us maybe know how we should present our information to these people. So I think it's being honest about not just saying we have uncertainty, but trying to be as clear as we can about where that uncertainty comes from, and then looking outside of our little world to how do you do decision making under uncertainty, the people who have studied this for decades, right?
Thanks. I'm interested in programmatically what you think about how to train the next generation of scientists who are doing this kind of fully integrated, very synthetic work. So you came from an engineering background and then became a geographer, and now your work is, you know, really integrating all of these things. So you've come to that, but how do we train students so that they can start with this idea?
So, you know, you could sort of divide that up into two camps, right? There's the generalist versus the expert, right? And I fall into the experts. You don't start by saying, I want to do all this interdisciplinary stuff and become a generalist. Maybe that works, but I don't think it works that well, to be really honest. I was able to do this because my training was very hardcore engineering computer science. I came at this from the informatics. I didn't try to even really, I've become an expert hydrologist. Like, I can call myself a hydrologist, right, Anne? Well, give me a check. But like, I did a lot of this by working with those experts. My expertise was the computer simulation. I can't do field work. Like, you do not want to send me out in the field. Like, that's why I work with these guys. I don't try to do everything. I am really good at certain things. I'm mostly good at software engineering, right? I work with the people who are good at these other things. So I think it's important is to make sure you're good, really good at something, right? Like, don't become the generalist. Make sure if you're the field hydrologist, you have really good training in that. But then what I did is I was willing to spend time and listen to and talk with people in these other disciplines and get involved in projects that was bringing the expert ecologist. Like, I learned so much by working in this Israel site I was talking about. I'm working with a hardcore physiologist, right? And I'm learning so much about trees from him. And so it's bringing experts together. So if you want to do that, make sure you're really good at something first. And then make sure you spend time doing these collaborative projects and learn how to listen. Learn how to ask the right questions so that you can understand something without having to know all the details, so you can have a good conversation with the artist or with the economist or with the field remote sensor. Anne and I can sit down and I can ask her all these dumb questions about remote sensing, but in a way that I get what I need from that, right? And I think it's learning how to do that, rather than trying to become a generalist and know all of this. You just can't do it.
So one of the things that I've noticed as, I guess, an aspiring hydrologic modeler is there's just so many different models. And even within the different sort of niche areas of, let's say, eco-hydrology, maybe just pure groundwater modeling, there's several different niches. But it seems like there's so many in it. It feels to me like we could be more productive if we kind of just rallied around a few of them and pushed to make those better. And I just wondered if you sort of shared those feelings, and if you did, if you thought like maybe how we could get there.
Well, I think it's a really good point, and I think the community has wrestled with that, and there's been a lot of work at Quasi I've been very involved with about, like, let's develop a community hydrology model, right? And we've more or less moved towards doing that, right? And there's been a bunch of initiatives. And there's now like a national water model that people have gotten behind. There are, there's CLM, and I think that's good, right? So I think you're right, and I think the hydrology community recognizes that, and it's been slowly over time investing in that. It's been hard to do because you're dealing with a bunch of people who say, well, it doesn't account for this and it doesn't account for that. And you can talk to various people who've led those initiatives and how hard it's been to get the community, the hydrology community, to coalesce around a single model. However, having said that, and I think that's a good thing, and I fully support that, at the same time, there's a danger with having one model, right? Because science evolves by diversity. And there isn't a one-size-fits-all model, because sometimes, it depends on the question you're asking, right? Asking these questions about field treatments at hill slope scales is going to require data and complexity that you're just you don't want in a national water model, right? You won't be able to run it over the whole US, right? It doesn't make sense. You won't have the data. So you also want to have models that are tailored to particular applications. So I think it's a balance. I don't think you want to get rid. There's a danger of the hydrology community saying this is our one model and we're all going to stand behind it. We want to have diversity. Diversity is strength, right? The climate modeling community is a good example, right? They don't have 50 million GCMs, but they don't just have one, right? Even in the US, there's more than one GCM. And so I think that's I don't know if that really answers your question, but that's how I've been thinking about it.
Naomi, wonderful talk and a great body of work. It's incredible. I have a question about the 6-year window to to back to normal, if you will, ET.
For the mid-elevation mixed conifer in the CZO, right?
Okay,
Just to be
for
clear.
those. So the question is, if you had to go back in and thin in that case, would you be thinning understory, or would you be thinning those big trees that got much healthier? Where's the growth, I guess?
Right, and I mean, this would be largely thinning. I'm trying to remember how we set that one up particularly, but this would be more thinning, understory with a few, but until you get to like 50%, and then obviously you're taking out some bigger trees to get there, right? But we're trying to go on this sort of understory thinning approach.
Okay.
But I mean, I think that's something we could do a lot more work on, about what will be how much do we have to resolve in the model to be able to capture the differences between, we can capture the difference between overstory and understory, but not really between necessarily really big trees and medium-sized trees. And we need a little more physical realism in the model before I think I can answer that question honestly.
Okay. It's sort of, to me, it's a question then of economics. If you just have to go in and thin understory, it's hard to sell that kind of wood.
Right,
Okay,
right.
thanks.
But you can do sort of some of each. It's tricky.
Thanks for speaking today. It was great. I was wondering if you could speak to sort of if you're looking into any other, I'm sure you're looking into a few other things, but other than sort of just purely water yield. And it seems like a lot of the restoration work and landscape management work is so focused on water yield when there are potentially a lot of other reasons for some of these fuel treatments or like meadow restoration work, even if we aren't increasing downstream yields.
Oh, 100%. Because I think actually the water yield is not a good reason to do this, but there are other reasons. Like one, the productivity of the remaining trees, right, which is important, right? That it speaks to ecosystem health. If you're actually going to log those things eventually, it would matter for that. It probably has an impact on your, these millions of trees that die, right? If you can reduce that, then that's a good reason to thin. Who cares about water yield, right? And in fact, you would sort of think that they balance each other, because if thinning is increasing the productivity of the remaining trees, that means it's not going into the stream, right? That's where it's going, into the other trees. And in a way, I think, let's save the forest for the forest. It's not just about water yield, and I completely agree. And then the really main reason to do this is to reduce fire severity. I just can't show you that because we haven't finished our fully coupled model, but my goal is to really be doing a talk about, long-term patterns in fire severity, because that's the expensive thing. Like, I don't think you're going to get that much water yield out of this, right? I really don't. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't thin forests. Why should you thin forests? Because we've had decades of suppression. And, not all forest, and it's different, it's a place-based thing, but it's clear that if you do this thinning, in some places, you'll probably reduce fire severity. And that matters, right?
Thank you.